So you want to play tank, but you're a bit held back by the extra responsibility that you'll have in your party. Well, today I'm going to show you that tanking is easy, and if you follow some easy tips, then you'll be tanking most content in the game without much effort. So what are these responsibilities? Well, you need to have aggro of the boss or the enemies that you're fighting. You need to mitigate incoming damage on yourself, and when we go into some more difficult content, you'll also be expected to mitigate party-wide damage. You're in charge of boss positioning, and you'll also want to be doing some damage, but everyone is expected to do that. Now, tanking in a dungeon is a little bit different from tanking a boss fight, so I'll cover dungeons first and then go over boss fights later. In terms of keeping aggro, all you really need to do for this is turn your tank stance on and hit mobs. Simple as that. The only time you might lose aggro is when you're gathering the mobs in a dungeon and you only hit them with one GCD, and one of your DPS players, for example, is hitting the mobs while you're running to the next group. During that, they might pull aggro, but don't worry, even if they were to pull aggro on one mob, they can survive a few auto attacks, and then once you've pulled everything together, you can just run over and get that aggro back. The way how you know if you have everything on you or not is by looking at the aggro list. It's this thing right here, and if all of the orbs next to the names are red, then that means that they're all targeting you. If an orb is green or orange, then that means they're targeting someone else. So you'll have to make sure to go grab that mob before they end up killing your DPS player or your healer. In terms of mitigation, the most dangerous parts of a dungeon are the trash pulls. You'll always want to try to do a wall-to-wall pull or big pulls, and the reason being is that it makes the most efficient use of not only your cooldowns, but those of the rest of the team as well. So always try to do a big pull first, and if you notice that the DPS is low or that your healer is struggling, then you can always slow it down later, but try to go big first. What you want to do is pull everything that you can until you hit a wall. Usually this is going to be 2 packs of mobs, and then start using some defensive mitigation. You have access to a lot of mitigation, but you'll want to stagger using them. Don't use everything at once. So an example would be, for the first pack, you use Rampart plus an extra cooldown like Arm's Length, Reprisal, or a cooldown that's unique to your tank like Camouflage or Thrill of Battle, and then you still have your spammable mitigation as well whenever that is ready. And what I mean by that is stuff like your Bloodwetting or Heart of Corundum. The mitigation that's on a very short cooldown. For the second pack then, you can use your 30% mitigation, like for example Vengeance, Nebula, those ones, and Reprisal will most likely be back up at this point as well, and then you still have your spammable mitigation too. And then you've covered both of the trash pulls, so now you're ready to go into the first mini-boss. Here, we don't really need to use much mitigation, as the auto attacks don't really hurt that much. If the boss does a tank buster, which is indicated by a big red marker on you, then you'll want to press at least one cooldown, but your spammable mitigation is going to be enough for this most of the time. If you really want to, you can add one more resource to it, but it's not really necessary. So if the boss is almost dead, but still does one tank buster at the end, you'll want to save your big cooldowns for the next set of trash pulls instead and just use that spammable one. For rate-wide damage, you can simply press Reprisal whenever you see a rate-wide casting, and you can also use your unique mitigation on top of that. Shake It Off, Heart of Light, that kind of stuff. But in dungeons it's not super important, it's more important in raids later. For positioning, during trash pulls, you'll want to try and group up the mobs as much as possible so that everybody has an easy time AoEing them all down. The more AoE people can do, the faster everything dies, the less healing is required, so try and group up as best as you can. For the mini-boss, you usually want to face the boss away from the party, and if you have a melee DPS in the group, try not to spin the boss around too much so that they have an easier time hitting positionals. You can also bring the boss back to the middle after it does a mechanic, as that sometimes makes things easier, but if you're pointing it away from the group, then that's usually good enough. So that does it for dungeons, but what about boss fights? Well, when we're talking about aggro, you're now working together with a co-tank. At the start of the fight, you'll decide who starts with the boss, and then that person will simply turn their tank stance on. However, it's still a good idea as the off-tank to turn your tank stance on as well 10 to 15 seconds into the fight. That way, if the main tank ends up dying to something, the boss will immediately turn its attention on you and you won't have to scramble to grab the aggro before one of your party members ends up dying to the boss's auto attacks. A lot of fights nowadays also require tank swaps, but this is also pretty easy. If you're the off-tank, simply press provoke to grab aggro of the boss and make sure that your tank stance is on, in case you hadn't turned that on yet. And if you're the main tank, then just wait for your off-tank to press provoke, and then all you have to do is press shirk on your off-tank. If you don't have shirk, just turn off your tank stance, and that will also take care of it. For personal mitigation, we will mainly be worrying about tank busters, but we can usually approach them with the same strategy as we do when we're doing big pulls in dungeons. 99% of the fights in this game have their tank busters spaced in such a way that you can use Rampart +1 plus a spammable mitigation for one tank buster, and then you have your 30% mitigation plus spammable for the second one. And then you can just almost always alternate between these two sets of cooldowns to take care of all of the tank busters in a fight. If you end up in a situation where it isn't possible, or you accidentally use too many cooldowns on a previous tank buster, you can still press your invuln and be fine. For party mitigation, it's the same as in dungeons. When you see a raid-wide casting, use Reprisal and maybe your other team-wide mitigation if that is ready, and that's all you need to do for that. For boss positioning, again, same thing as in dungeons. Face it away from the group, and you usually want to try to keep the boss in the middle of the map as well. And that's really all there is to it. So as you can see, it's nothing too complex, and with a little bit of practice, you'll be tanking any content in the game just fine. So with that, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my patrons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.